Welcome to another episode of the NEI podcast. We're excited to offer you a special bonus episode sponsored by Pear Therapeutics. Learn all about the incredible field of prescription digital therapeutics and what it can do for your clinical practice. Here's your host for this special episode, Chief Medical Officer at NEI, Dr. Andrew Cutler.
This is Dr. Andy Cutler, Chief Medical Officer of the Neuroscience Education Institute. Today, our topic is Therapeutics in the Digital Age, Redefining Care with Software-Based Medicines. And it's a real pleasure for me to be speaking with Dr. Corey McCann, who's an MD, PhD, and is President and CEO of Pear Therapeutics. Welcome, Corey.
Thanks, Andy. Pleasure to be here.
Well, we're going to be talking about the concept of prescription digital therapies, and we're going to be talking specifically about what Pear's been up to and what they're doing and kind of what you're planning for the future. But first, why don't we talk a little bit about your background? Can you just tell me a little about your background, Corey?
Absolutely, Andy. I think I would describe myself as a nerd by birth. So I grew up outside of the Philadelphia area to a set of academic parents, trained initially as a physician neuroscientist. I spent a bunch of time looking at really the interplay between molecules and activity patterns in doing things like patterning the developing brain, but then also in neuroplasticity and recovery from brain injury. And folks may have seen this thing called the Brainbow mouse. If you're in front of your computer, Google Brainbow. You'll see all sorts of cool pictures. And essentially what we used to do was make mice express all different colored jellyfish proteins, use those proteins in combination, and really use it to map out neural circuits at the cellular. I continue to absolutely love science. I hope to at some point retire to a rocking chair in a lab. That's my passion. But took a little bit of a non-traditional course after my MD PhD. Went to a firm called McKinsey, which is a management consulting firm. And I really did all of the things that you would expect a management consultant to do. Made a lot of PowerPoint slides, made a lot of Excel models, but really did all of that within the healthcare industry. And ran a small part of McKinsey's healthcare practice out of their New York office. Next post, made another bit of a non-traditional transition and moved over to venture capital and really was a biotech and medical device investor. I used to look at something like 1,500 technologies a year. Wow. And I'm really passionate about resource allocation toward new therapeutics and new medicines. And in the process of sort of scouring the entirety of the space, I came across this antithetical concept of using software to directly treat human disease. And we started looking at this about 2010, looked at a couple of hundred different university and small company-based technologies. And I personally became very convicted that there was an opportunity to really create a whole new therapeutic class. And so that's become something called digital therapeutics. And that's what we've built really Pear in order to develop.
Wow. So you started Pear back in 2012, is that correct?
That's correct. We started Pear back in 2012.
Well, that's really incredible. So you really have had a very interesting journey to this point, I would say. And I should just warn our audience, if you hear my strong Philadelphia accent coming out, it's because I'm from Philadelphia, as Corey's from the Philly area. So we have to be a little careful that we don't need a translator for our discussion here. But
this might be Philadelphia accent overload, so I'll try to keep it straight.
It could be. Okay, so that's sort of the genesis of Pear. You've kind of brought us up to that. What was it about this that got you excited?
You know, if you rewind the tape, we, again, back in 2010, just saw this opportunity to create a fundamental therapeutic modality within healthcare. And when I say fundamental, I mean as fundamental as things like monoclonal antibodies or things like cell and or gene therapies. We just saw this platform and this opportunity to create treatments for hundreds of different conditions utilizing pieces of software. We saw the beginnings of some interesting clinical data in a number of different indications, but we didn't see what were the rigors that you would traditionally expect to see in order to make something mainstream medicine. So we didn't see randomized clinical data. We didn't see regulatory oversight. We didn't see the same sorts of teams that you would expect to see in the traditional biotech market. And so really a lot of what we're about at Pear is trying to take this new modality of software and use it to create what is a curated cognitive experience, but to do all of that with the same rigors that you would expect to see from a drug, and ultimately to make software-based therapeutics just as accessible and just as prevalent as current drugs.
Well, this is very exciting. I have to be honest with you. This is something that I've certainly been interested in as well for a few years now. And if we think back to 2010, 2012, that really was kind of the early days for this. I mean, back then, of course, we were starting to have apps, healthcare sort of apps to track things. But we're talking about something that's far beyond an app, aren't we?
Oh, I absolutely. And, there's an anchoring definition here, which is prescription digital therapeutic, or PDT. And so I sort of started off by just anchoring on the notion that this is soft, but this is a space that has become called prescription digital therapeutics. And you'll hear me say PDT probably 50 times during our time together today. These are products that utilize software to activate different brain circuitry. In some cases, that software would be an app. In some cases, that software would be a VR-based experience. In some cases, the software may be mobile and or interact with different digital biomarkers or different wearables. But ultimately, it is designed to treat human disease as opposed to for a health and wellness condition. It is measured for its ability to treat human disease in randomized clinical trials.
Right.
And those randomized clinical trials are designed in collaboration with regulators like the FDA, so that the products go through a regulatory approval process and ultimately end up with a product label that reads very much like the label that you would expect to see for deployed in real world. They're deployed under a prescription. That's the P and PDT. But unlike drugs, they're able to collect really just voluminous, multi-source longitudinal data sets, so that for the first time, we're able to measure the impact of the therapeutics that we deliver.
Wow. Well, let's back up a little. Let's talk a little more about this regulatory pathway. I mean, our audiences are probably familiar with the FDA's regulatory pathway for medications, but they may not be as familiar for software or devices. Can we talk a little bit about this pathway?
Yeah, absolutely. So these products are, technically speaking, software as a medical device. And I'll try to stay light on the acronyms, but the acronym there would be SAMD if you're looking to Google the term. They are, technically speaking, class 2 medical devices, which means that they are medical devices of moderate risk. And the way that we've developed these products really relies upon two things. The first is there is a quality management system, and in the drug world, we would call it GMP. So there's a set of processes that need to be satisfied in terms of validating that the software is created and is what we say the software is. And that includes things like the way in which we write code. It also includes things like the cybersecurity protocols that we employ. And then the second thing that's really important to regulators and frankly to Pear is that these products demonstrate in the context of randomized clinical trials the ability to produce efficacy in a patient population that is understood and is measured via a traditional set of endpoints that are understood. And so I'm sure we'll get to it, but I think it's probably makes sense just to give a quick example. If you look at what was the first PDT, so said differently, this was the first piece of software to ever receive disease treatment claims from the FDA for any condition. That's Pear's Reset product.
Okay,
and
so you guys had you have the first product.
We actually have the first three in this product class are Reset, Reset O, and Somers products.
Oh, wow. Incredible. So Reset was the first FDA authorized product, as you said, in this pathway of software as medical device. I mean, we're used to thinking about devices to treat disease more like, I don't know, a stent, or an artificial joint or something like that, something that an interventional radiologist might use. So this is kind of This is not a thing. It's like you said, it's software, but it can be deployed, it sounds like, in a number of different ways. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. And I think your analogy to either a stent or a stimulator, I think, it's fair for people to think about these things in some ways like other therapeutic medical devices. I've mentioned that, we had the first 3 of these products approved. We've got the next 14 plus in the pipeline. And,
Wow.
we've started in addiction and insomnia, but we really think that that's just the tip of the iceberg. And, when I said that we think these things could be as fundamental as monoclonal antibodies, I wasn't doing that to be hyperbolic. I think when we do the bottom up build, we believe that there are several hundred different diseases that one can treat with software as a medical device or a prescription digital therapeutic. In a lot of cases, they are related to mental and behavioral health. That's where we started. But we have products for things like oncology, like cardiovascular disease. There are really opportunities across disease areas in order to create efficacy with pieces of software.
So, Corey, it sounds like the software, the technology is actually the treatment here.
Andy, I think you nailed it there. The software in and of itself is actually the therapeutic modality. And maybe just to make that concept just a bit more real, I'll describe briefly Pear's Reset and Reset-O products. And those products deliver a very specific type of cognitive behavioral therapy called community reinforcement approach, or CRA. And when the patient interacts with those modules, that actually produces neuroplasticity in the patient's brain, and it sets up a set of neural circuits that bias the patient toward abstinent behavior. We also use something else that's called contingency management. And contingency management is a variable reward schedule that really is able to activate the dopaminergic circuitry in the addicted patient's brain. And for people who treat these patients, that they're very attracted to things like variable reward schedules. And so if you marry that active ingredient, which is the cognitive behavioral therapy modules, with the community reinforcement approach, we're basically able to create the equivalent of a dose response curve where CM drives the dose and the CBT modules drive the neuroplasticity and ultimately the behavioral change.
My goodness. This is almost science fiction, I have to tell you. This is incredible. Earlier, you were talking about how this is in many ways almost like the monoclonal antibody revolution. I mean, this really is a whole new modality that you're in the vanguard
of. We certainly believe so. And again, when we look at the opportunity space, we think that there will be several hundred different diseases that are ultimately treated with software as a first-line therapy. In some cases, as we've seen with our Reset product, that these pieces of software will treat conditions that were previously untreatable by drugs. So that product treats addiction to things like cannabis, cocaine, and stimulants, including methamphetamine, where there just isn't an approved drug to treat those patients. Then in some cases, the products will work with our Reset-O product works with buprenorphine as part of a combination therapy to make that product more effective. And then lastly, and possibly most exciting, in some cases, these products will directly compete with and replace drugs. And so our Somryst product is indicated as a first-line treatment for patients with chronic insomnia, and that is before habit-forming medications like benzodiazepines or zolpidem.
Well, that's remarkable. So you're talking about really a continuum here from a standalone treatment to an augmentation or to something used in combination with medication or even other modalities.
That's absolutely right. I think, there are a lot of opportunities here. And I think I've said that maybe 4 times now. So people should know that I'm bullish on the modality and on the opportunities. Really what we do is we start with the patient population and the condition and work backward in order to understand what to build. And so again, take our addiction products. There are no drugs for treatment of addiction to cannabis, cocaine, and stimulants. So it's pretty obvious that you build a monotherapy. And I think if you look at the clinical literature, just about every patient who is dependent on opioids should be on some form of medication-assisted therapy. It could be Vivitrol, it could be methadone, it could be buprenorphine. but
Mhm.
that's a place where you pretty obviously build a drug software combination.
How did it come about that you started out with substance use and insomnia? Why were those the first couple of indications?
Yeah, one of the things that we've been very good at is collaborating with academics and
Hmm.
academic medical centers.
Hmm.
And I mentioned that we've been following the space for a decade. And really, two of the academics who've done some of the seminal work happen to be doing that work in addiction and in insomnia. And
Okay.
so the addiction product was studied heavily by a PI out of Dartmouth. And there was a good deal of National Institute of Drug Abuse funding that went into really developing what are the most effective software based algorithms for addiction conditions. Similarly, in insomnia, there's a group out of the University of Virginia that's done much of the seminal work in developing software based therapeutics for insomnia. And so really our initial path was to follow the data because that data is fundamentally what was differentiating between the assets that I just described and all of the apps that you might just download on the App Store.
Right, right. So it's very important for our audience who may not be familiar with this to distinguish. These are not apps you download from the App Store, right? How exactly does this get into the hands of a patient?
Yeah. So the P in PDT stands for prescription, and so these are products that come from your prescribing. That prescribing event really is as simple as a click of a couple of buttons on the clinician back end, and that then puts the patient in touch with what we call Pear Connect, which is our facility that supports patients and clinicians, and also bills claims to insurance companies.
Hmm.
And so the patient uses their own mobile device, either iOS or Android. They download the app from the App Store, but then that app is really only available when the patient has a prescription. I think the other thing that's fundamentally different here is that these are products that create an open communication loop with the clinician. And so the clinician has a dashboard that they utilize not just to write prescriptions, but also to track patient progress in the real world. And what we see is that this is really a virtuous cycle. So the more a clinician interacts with the dashboard, generally speaking, we see a very positive correlation to enhance patient outcomes.
Hmm. That's amazing. So hang on. You did say that you can download the app from the App Store, but is it not activated until you get the prescription, or what's the
That's
connection?
exactly right. So the patient
Okay.
uses their own phone and they download off the App Store. And then you can really think about part of the activation process is being something as simple as a code that
I
comes
see.
via the prescription.
Okay, got it. Right. So that's the closing the loop of how it actually gets activated, if you will.
That's right.
Okay, yeah. How do PDTs, besides we talked about the range of ways they can be used, there's monotherapy or in combination with other things. Why are PDTs important to the continuum of care, especially in mental health?
Yeah, I think the case is pretty easy to make in mental health. As you know from your background, developing compounds in this space is difficult.
Sure
And
is.
there are a lot of people doing great work out there developing new pharmaceutical compounds for mental and behavioral health. But it's pretty fair to say that most of what you see today will be the drug armamentarium for the next decade or so.
Hmm.
And so we really see these as fundamentally the only way that we're going to be able to make progress in treatment of many of these conditions. And that is under the best possible conditions from the perspective purely of efficacy. So that's sort of the ivory tower perspective. I think as we all know, living during COVID, that's not the way that the world works. And we've seen what is an increase in triggers and a decrease in access. And that's made things like mental health conditions, it's made things like addiction conditions just really go off the charts in terms of their severity. And so with PDT, what you're able to do is provide access, you're able to decrease stigma, and you're able to do all of this in a way in which can be quantified such that the patient is able to communicate with the clinician via the dashboard. and ultimately drive outcomes that are just superior to what's been seen without the PDT.
Yeah. Well, it seems like this is we're coming to an important moment here because people are now so familiar with technology in a way that they weren't a generation ago. Cell phones are ubiquitous. People are used to interacting with their phones. They're used to interacting with other people through their devices and through software. So it seems like this is the right thing at the right time in a lot of ways.
We certainly believe it is. And I think through COVID, you've seen that tipping point around telemedicine. Looking at a lot of the patient preference surveys, many patients, myself included, would prefer in cases where it's available, a tele encounter versus a brick and mortar encounter. I think that's
Absolutely.
just what we're dealing with. And I think the thing that telemedicine doesn't address are provider shortages. That's sort of
Right.
the dirty secret of telemedicine, which is you can increase access, but you haven't actually increased capacity. And I think
Right.
that's a really nice place where PDTs fit in ultimately into what is a fully remote care model, which is telemedicine blended with PDTs.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, we've heard about the shortage of mental health care providers pre-COVID, but during the COVID era in particular, the needs have skyrocketed. I mean, there was an article in JAMA that showed there's been a tripling of the incidence of depression, for instance, during the COVID
Mhm.
pandemic. And I heard a recent statistic more germane to your current products. There were over 90,000 opioid overdose deaths in the past year alone. It's an all-time high.
I would certainly submit that we can and need to do better. The numbers are just staggering.
Yeah, absolutely. So the idea here then is we can expand access potentially, meet patients where they're at. As I mentioned, patients are certainly becoming much more accepting and familiar with technology. And I think almost more importantly here is the clinicians we're becoming. COVID certainly has accelerated a lot of our technological literacy, if you will, just simply evidenced by the adoption of telemedicine.
Absolutely. I mean, we're seeing clinician both familiarity and preference with
Yeah.
digital formats. And, I think that's really the future of this blended care model is the PDT backend dashboard open alongside of a telemedicine window such that as the telemedicine encounter is being conducted, that it's really much more structured and it's informed by the real world data that's being collected by the PDT.
Hmm. Amazing. Well, let's talk a little bit about your current products in a little more detail. You have described them, but you mentioned you've got three products. Could you just quickly tell us the three products and at a high level, how do they work?
Sure. So we've got 3 commercial products and another 14 in mid to late stage pipeline development. The 3 commercial products are called Reset, Reset O, and Somrest. Reset and Reset O are directed toward different addiction conditions. Reset is indicated to treat addiction to alcohol, cannabis, cocaine, and stimulants. And it's a monotherapy. So said
Mhm.
differently, it's for use without any sort of drug in combination.
Yeah. Well, as you've mentioned, there's really nothing approved, although I guess for alcohol, there's a few things approved, but they're not very effective.
Yeah, certainly the case is much clearer cut for things like methamphetamine use disorder. And when we do our work in states like California, methamphetamine is just absolutely ravaging that state. And there is nothing else. Reset is the only product which is indicated for the treatment of methamphetamine use disorder.
That's right.
So that's the first product. And again, it's a monotherapy. It's software alone.
Mhm.
The product that follows is called Reset O, and that product is for use to treat opiate use disorder.
Mhm.
And it is for use in combination with a pharmaceutical medication that's called buprenorphine.
I see.
The third product is called Somrest, and that product is the only guideline recommended first line treatment for chronic insomnia. And something that, many clinicians might not be aware of is if you look at the medications for insomnia, they're actually contraindicated for chronic insomnia and only indicated for short-term use in
That's right.
insomnia. So that's
That's
things
right.
like Zolpidem, like benzodiazepines. Many of these
Mhm.
products are on the Beers list. They're to be
Mhm.
actively avoided,
Mhm.
and they
That's
have
right.
terrible habit forming and dose rate limiting side effects. And so this is a product that really is able to provide a similar degree of efficacy and effectiveness versus the sleep medications in the space. It's actually able to exceed the effectiveness of those sleep medications in the space. For example, in our clinical trials, it showed a durable 18-month insomnia outcome after just 9 weeks of use. So this is really changing neural circuitry in order to treat disease. And it does all of that with a very, very much more favorable side effect profile versus the medications that I just mentioned.
Of course. Wow. Now, you mentioned that this is guideline recommended. Is this the American Academy of Sleep Medicine or what? Which guideline are we talking about?
Yes. So across a number of different clinical guidelines, there is a stipulation for first line, what's called CBTI treatment. CBTI stands for cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. And speaking of provider mismatches, there are several hundred clinicians who are CBTI trained, and there are approximately 30 million Americans who suffer from chronic insomnia. And so this product is actually labeled to be able to deliver CBTI to patients.
Wow. That's incredible. So this takes us back to the beginning of our conversation when we talked about being evidence-based. This is a much higher bar, a much higher standard of evidence required here than simply an app or some other type of digital intervention.
Yeah, I think as everyone becomes more familiar with prescription digital therapeutics, I think skepticism is appropriate. And I think the killer question for clinicians here is, so what's your clinical data? And so what's your product label?
Exactly.
There are many apps in the world. We certainly did not invent apps. We didn't invent software, but this is just a fundamentally different level of rigor that's associated with making sure that these products are effective, but also making sure that these products are safe. There is a degree of safety monitoring that goes along with our clinical studies. We actually have safety on label. And then I mentioned Pear Connect. We have, even in the real world, an ongoing safety monitoring effort for patients who utilize the products. Because again, we're not going after healthy normals. What we're trying to do is treat some of the sickest patients, in many cases, Medicaid patients. And these patients are fragile. And that's where the safety element comes in to be quite important.
Yeah, and you also mentioned earlier the importance you place on security and privacy, which I think is extremely important nowadays as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's a saying in the consumer tech space that if you didn't pay for it, it's stealing your data. I think that's something that people need to just be very cognizant of as they're downloading different health apps. This is a fundamentally different cybersecurity standard that we're held to. We also have a very strong commitment that we don't push ads. We don't sell data. This is very much like a pharmaceutical medication product, which is reimbursed by the insurance company or the payer. And in many cases, it's reimbursed because of the real world health economic outcomes that we're able to demonstrate.
This is fascinating. I want to get back to something else you were talking about, which is sometimes we think about CBT as just being positive reinforcement or behavior change, but you're talking about not only that, but actually it sounds like you're talking about neurogenesis and synaptogenesis and circuitry, rewiring the brain almost. Tell me a little more about the biologic basis of this.
Yeah, I mean, CBT means different things to different people. And I think, CBT has become a bit of a wastebasket term. And certainly if you search CBT app on the App Store or on Google, you will get all sorts of things, and Lord knows what they are. We use what is very specific types of CBT, and you can think about these as being PhD level CBT curricula, and that CBT is different depending on the condition treated and depending on the product. And so again, in the case of Reset and Reset-O, we use something that's called community reinforcement approach. And this is a deeply studied and deeply validated talk therapy protocol that's specific to addiction. In insomnia, we use something that's called CBTI. And this involves things like an algorithmically driven sleep restriction window, followed by motivational techniques and learning techniques on the back of that initial sleep restriction. So all of the CBT is very deeply tailored to the particular patient population. And then I think the neuroscientist in me sort of thinks about this very simplistically, which is your phone or any screen is delivering multisensory stimuli. It's coming in via your eyes, it's coming in via your ears. And the convergence of that multisensory stimuli changes neural circuitry. It causes synaptogenesis and synaptic plasticity. And it is at that synaptic plasticity where behavior is really changed and where patients ultimately are treated with these conditions.
This reminds me of something I learned during my residency, which is that psychotherapy can be thought of as a biologic treatment. I mean, it really is rewiring the brain, and you talk about the neuroplasticity. I mean, every experience we have, as you said, listening to the sound of our voices talking today is having biologic changes in people's brains. So clearly, this is it's not an entirely new concept, although the technology certainly is. I'm curious about how the process works with the patient interacting and interfacing with these treatments. How passive is it? How much is the patient sort of, taking things in? And how active is it? How interactive is it?
So certainly patient engagement is something which is highly important here. It's something for which we optimize. And each one of our products is very, very specifically created in order to optimize for patient engagement. That said, I think we're all familiar with the notion that if you run a clinical study that requires patients to engage for 12 hours a week, that's not going to happen in the real world. And so a lot of what we do in our phase 1 studies is to try to understand what are practical rates of engagement to expect within a given patient population, and then how do we optimize that engagement. And so in the case of Reset, Reset-O, and Somryst, these are really bite-sized interactions. Reset and Reset-O are module-based, and each of the modules works on a different concept within the community reinforcement approach curricula. Those modules are audio, they're video. They take anywhere between 10 and 20 minutes in order to complete. And then on the back end of those modules, we use something that's called fluency training, which is a set of repetitive and algorithmically driven question and answers that really helps to cement the neural circuitry that's been laid down in each of the modules. And if we look at the real world dose, we see clinical effect in clinical studies as well as in the real world for patients who use anywhere between 1 and 2 modules per week, which is on the low end, 10 minutes of engagement, on the high end, 30 to 40 minutes of engagement. And we see patients doing this across 3, 6, 9, and 12-month treatment courses.
You're saying 10 to 30 minutes per week of engagement?
That is right. No, per week. And in the pivotal clinical study, the Reset product was examined head to head. And in that particular case, about 30 minutes per week of face-to-face clinician time plus Reset outperformed 4 hours per week of face-to-face time.
Oh my goodness, that's dramatic. Now, when you said that there's a question and answer section, is the question and answer, is the person speaking and their voice being recorded, or are they typing something in? How is that interface happening?
Yeah, so it's everything from multiple choice to free response. Access is a huge part of addressing this patient population. And so the products are created to be usable down to about a 5th or 6th grade reading level. For patients who are not able to read, there is an audio component associated with the products. And we're also quite excited to be releasing the products in Spanish. Really, these are products that we believe would resonate with folks like you and I, but are designed for patients and in many cases in collaboration with patients to meet them where they are in their recovery journey.
Well, incredible, obviously. Let's talk a little bit about, you mentioned earlier that there's potential here for literally 100 or hundreds of different disease states. Was that what you said earlier?
I know it sounds crazy, but we believe that there is the opportunity for hundreds of different disease states to be. Right now, we have about 14 products in the pipeline with proof of concept data of one flavor or another. And when you start to think about really the combination of these products with digital biomarkers, with wearables, and ultimately directing drug dosing in real time, you can get into some somatic conditions like oncology, like cardiovascular, like obesity. There's just a tremendous opportunity here to make software mainstream disease treatment across most conditions.
Wow. Yeah, it is remarkable. I mean, I've been saying for years, we know technology is going to revolutionize how we deliver healthcare. We just don't know exactly how yet because it's evolving so fast. And you are blowing my mind. I have to be honest here. Thinking about
You're too
this.
kind.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's quite remarkable. I mean, as an example of this, you mentioned, Pear had the very first FDA authorized PDT. And I believe as of today, there's about 6 products on the market and you've got 3 of them.
That is true. And I think as of actually today, and depending on how you count, everyone's definitions might be a bit different, but there are 7 or 8. There was actually, just as of today, another PDT announced. So it's an incredibly exciting time to be in the space. But you're exactly right. We had the first 3. Our Reset product was, again, the first piece of software to ever receive disease treatment claims for the treatment of any condition. And we're very proud of that watershed moment. And really, we are deeply in our commercial phase right now. So it's not good enough to just produce clinical trial results.
Right.
It's not good enough to just get FDA authorizations. It is our mission to put these products in the hands of patients and really to make them mainstream standard of care.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, and commercialization is a whole nother animal, obviously. I sometimes use the analogy if a tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it. So you might have the best tree, but we've got to get people to hear about it here. So I can imagine that's also a complicated task as well, trying to commercialize these products.
That's exactly right. And, we have this core value around Pear, which is never satisfied. And we're certainly not satisfied with only bringing these products through to regulatory approval. And so across the balance of the last about 36 months, we have been working with clinicians, many of whom I hope are listening, to really convert them as active prescribed. Right now, we're prescribed by about 800 clinicians across more than 35 states. And in many cases, we are seeing the product become standard of care within some very large healthcare networks. So that's the prescribing end. We're doing yeoman's work with payers and bringing the products onto formulary access. We announced a couple of weeks ago that the state of Massachusetts actually made our Reset and Reset O products available to all Medicaid patients in the state, which in the addiction space is something which is just incredibly important. And then because these are digital products, there's a data layer here. And so what we've built is the opportunity to really quantify health economic and real world healthcare impact by patients who utilize these products in a commercial setting. And we continue to publish papers showing dollar amount savings as well as things like reduction in inpatient hospitalizations and emergency department utilization. And we do that across time for patients who are utilizing these products in the real world.
So you're not only generating traditional efficacy and safety data, you're also generating HEOR data, the health economics outcome type data as well. That's quite impressive. And that's often what moves the needle with payers, as you mentioned.
This is Andy, where it just gets unbelievably exciting for me. And that's why I have to pipe in. We have unprecedented data. And I think the lesson here is if you give patients technology, they won't really use it. But if you give patients technology that makes them better, it becomes an integral part of their life. And since we have such high rates of patient and clinician engagement, what we see are these very powerful longitudinal data sets that include engagement and patient-reported outcomes. They include clinician-reported outcomes via our clinician dashboard. They, in many cases, are integrated into health systems and include claims data to look at outcomes. And then we've even been able to look across payers and understand all claims and utilization for patients before and after they utilize the products.
Yeah. Well, this really does lend itself to data tracking in a way that probably some of our traditional therapies don't, or make it harder to do.
Exactly right.
You mentioned the HCP dashboard. So not only is the patient engaging in an ongoing way, but the provider can engage in an ongoing way. Tell us a little more about how that works.
Yeah, so there is a clinician dashboard which starts the cascade. So that is the place from which the clinician initially prescribes.
Mm-hmm.
From that dashboard, the clinician can also monitor their patient population and their census, both patients who are and are not on the prescription digital therapeutic products. And in the case of Reset and Reset O, for example, this is a dashboard which is very heavily utilized by both the prescribing clinician, be them doctor or nurse practitioner. It's also utilized by the therapist and the social worker. And in some cases, it's utilized by health coaches as well. So it's everything from engagement data through to patient reported outcomes around abstinence, through to very specific concept proficiency associated with the different community reinforcement approach or CRA modules.
So this would notify me, for instance, if I had a patient that I'd prescribed this to and they started using it but dropped off and didn't keep using it, this would alert me to that fact so I'd have the opportunity to intervene and support them and say, what's going on here?
So it's the concept of alerts is an interesting one. And what we find is that many clinicians are not looking for alerts. What they're looking for is access to data. And so in the situation that you just described, you would have the data and you would have the opportunity to intervene on the basis of that data, but you would not receive alerts and you would not receive the liability that comes with those alerts.
That's well said. I see what you're saying. I mean, obviously compliance or adherence, if you will, to any therapy is a big issue. So I would have the opportunity, though, in real time to be able to log into the dashboard and see that my patient has not continued using the product. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And I think that's the virtuous cycle, is one where clinicians are checking into the dashboard and asking their patients about content from some of the different modules, and where patients are logging into the patient-facing app and they are really looking to their clinicians to have awareness of their utilization of the therapeutic. That's really the situation where we see the greatest real-world effect, is where the number of dashboard-based engagements is high, and that's really what drives a lot of the patient compliance.
Is there a way to interact with the patient through this technology?
So as it currently stands, this is not a messaging platform, but it works alongside of the existing messaging platforms that have been deployed pretty broadly at this point.
Yeah, no, that's true. We certainly have lots of ways of communicating with our patients nowadays, emails, texts, and through portals and things like that. I wanted to talk also a little bit about how a clinician can get support. Technological proficiencies, as you know, varies widely amongst our colleagues and providers. How would somebody get support to use this product? Is that the Pear Connect?
That is the Pear Connect facility. So we have a facility in Raleigh, North Carolina, and we have a whole set of different triage algorithms that assist that facility as well. I think it's really important to just note here that it's incumbent upon Pear to make sure that the clinician is comfortable with the technology that's being utilized. And when the patient has questions about the technology, which invariably happens, that's where Pear Connect steps in and addresses those patient questions. Really, it's meant to be a set it and forget it solution, where to the extent that the clinician is logging into the dashboard and engaging with the patient, all of the technical details around I've lost my password, around my phone battery died, around you name it, that's all on Pear.
Got it. So the patient can literally call. There's a phone number, or do you email? How do you interact?
That's right. There's a text exchange with Pear Connect, and then there's also telephonic support.
Okay, great. So different ways to interact. And then for the clinician, when they need help and support, would they also go through Pear Connect?
Absolutely. They go through Pear Connect as well. And we also have a boots on the ground field force who for really some of our larger deployments has worked with and continues to work with prescribing clinicians in order to really help them to understand all of the ways in which they can create the most value from the tool.
I'm also fascinated. You talked a little bit about not only are we creating immediate change or short-term change, but there's an enduring effects here. Do you imagine that these products would be utilized for a period of time, and then maybe there'd be boosters, if you will, much like we talk about booster vaccines, every couple times a year or some thereafter? I mean, how does this work once you get through the acute phase of the treatment?
Yeah, I mean, I think much like drug therapy, it depends on the condition that's being treated.
Mhm.
And so, if we look at our Somryst product for chronic insomnia, that
Mhm.
product by and large seems to be a one-time therapy where
Mhm.
a 9-week treatment course is able to continue to produce statistically and clinically significant benefit out to 18 months. In the case of Reset and Reset O for addiction, I mean, addiction is a chronic relapsing condition.
Exactly. That's right.
And we see many patients who are on the product for 6, 9, and 12 months. We see some patients who have lasting change after 3 months, but it is much more specific to the individual patient journey.
Mhm.
And we're also there if and when relapse takes place, such
Right.
that we can match the acuity of the treatment with the acuity of the condition. And then we got some products like our schizophrenia product, which
Mhm.
are more than likely apt to be chronic therapies and
Okay.
become part of schizophrenic patients' lives, really at steady state chronically, very much in the same way that the atypical antipsychotic is a
Mhm.
long-term treatment.
Right. So what's the current for Reset and Reset O? What is the current recommendation? I'm assuming the labeling talks about the duration of use, if you will, and how to handle this. What's the current recommendation for how to use
Yeah, so
this over time?
So the current recommendation for Reset in particular is that this is a 12-week
Hmm.
prescription digital therapeutic, which
Right.
is indicated to enhance rates of abstinence and enhance retention and treatment for the
Hmm.
conditions that I mentioned previously: alcohol, cannabis, cocaine, and stimulants. I think just like you can refill a prescription bottle of medication, you can refill a PDT. And so we've
Got it.
done a whole series of publications around quote unquote refill prescriptions. And what
Uh-huh.
we see is that rates of engagement in a refill, so subsequent 12 weeks, is actually higher than in the initial 12 weeks. And we see
Interesting.
incremental benefit for patients who are on that
Got it.
refill prescription, if you will.
Now you mentioned the indication here is for abstinence and to continue in treatment to enhance the treatment. So this is meant to be used with a more traditional substance abuse treatment modality over
Yes,
the
and
course. Yeah,
that's where the clinician dashboard comes in. I
I
think
see.
we've seen in clinical studies everything from complete replacement all the way through to addition, and this partial replacement model really seems to be the one that
Got
creates
it.
the greatest benefit for the clinician and for the patient. And
Got
so
it.
it is substituting a part of the clinician's time for the digital therapeutic.
Now, is the same true for Reset O? You mentioned Reset O is to be used in combination with medication assisted treatment or medication specifically. So is it the same kind of way there, or is it a little different?
No, that's correct. That product is again specifically for opiate use disorder, and it's specifically for use in combination with buprenorphine. I think if you sort of take a step back and think about treatment of opiate dependent patients, I think the literature for medication assisted therapy is quite strong,
Hmm.
and we do not put forth the position that patients with opiate dependence should be taken off of MAT. So hence
Yeah,
this is a
makes
combination
sense.
therapy. As prescribers of MAT know, those products come with requirements for wraparound support. So you can't
Right,
just prescribe buprenorphine and walk away. And
right.
so this is a product that has the ability to enhance documentation and to really
Yes.
satisfy those documentation requirements for behavioral support associated with buprenorphine.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense. And then for Somryst, of course, you mentioned that is for use completely standalone by itself, correct?
We've seen the product used standalone and for itself. It's also a prescription product with a back end dashboard. I think it's still early days for the commercial deployment there. And we're still really working to understand the impact of the dashboard use and the clinician. there are just so many fewer clinicians and such less clinician time in order to interact with that dashboard that it's a little bit more of a standalone model.
Got it. Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit where Pear is headed. What's coming up next? You alluded to, I believe you said 14 products in the pipeline at this point that have proof of concept.
That's exactly right. And if we sort of zoom out and think about the long game here, I mean, really, we are capitalized and committed in order to make software mainstream medicine. We are laser focused right now on our commercial products, Reset, Reset-O, and Somrest.
Mm-hmm.
But we are building out what is a portfolio of mental and behavioral health assets next. We actually just announced FDA breakthrough designation for our Reset-A product for alcohol use disorder specifically.
Oh my!
And we are continuing to. Thank you so much. We're working to put forth a comprehensive portfolio of products in mental and behavioral health.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's conditions like schizophrenia, bipolar, PTSD, and major depression.
Right.
All of those products roll up to the same dashboard and the same infrastructure. And so really the vision that we have is that engaging clinicians are able to see their census and they're able to then understand which patients may benefit from a prescription digital therapeutic and with a click of a button prescribe right in the dashboard that they're already in. So that's sort of the midterm for us.
Mm-hmm.
And then, as I mentioned, there are a couple of hundred different opportunities here. And we believe that if you fast forward, no clinician will be on 10 different prescription digital therapeutic dashboards at the same time. That's just not efficient. That's not what anyone wants.
Right.
We think that there's really the opportunity to create what is the platform for the space. So for Pear's assets, as well as the assets of other companies, and in the same way that currently most clinicians are either Epic clinicians or Cerner clinicians, they're not both. We see sort of a similar dynamic play out here.
Yeah.
And what we're trying to build is all of the infrastructure that makes these products as usable and as accessible as they can possibly.
Got it. So the dashboard itself is a product as well, if you will.
That's exactly right. The dashboard, the data collection capabilities, Pear Connect, the support capabilities. It's really all part of what we would call our PDT engine, which we think can be a huge catalyst for the space in bringing these products to patients.
Yeah. I mean, this is a horrible analogy and you'll have to excuse me. I'm sure you're going to think this is pretty sophomoric, but it reminds me of the Apple universe in a way. You've had you've got iTunes, you've got the App Store, you've got your iPhone, your iPad. You're creating that same kind of interactive universe, it sounds like.
Yeah, I think building the infrastructure and really linking all of these different disparate apps is something which is going to be critical for clinicians and for patients. And so I think your Apple metaphor, it's not the worst one I've ever heard.
Yeah, I'm sure. And I mean, obviously Pear is the name of a fruit and you're a technology-based company. So the analogies are obvious. I wanted to zoom in a little more specifically on your psychiatry assets that you're talking about. It sounds like near term, those are the ones that are really priorities for you. So certainly for our audience, this is very exciting especially when you talk about depression or schizophrenia. What's the plan here? What's the timeline for getting something like that to the market?
Yeah, so in the nearest term, again, we'll continue to work on our alcohol use disorder asset,
that makes
as well
sense.
as our major depression asset. And if you think about that portfolio being able to cover really all of the different forms of addiction and insomnia and depression, you could argue that you've got, let's say, 2/3 of the mental and behavioral health space covered. We also have what are active efforts ongoing around some of the other conditions in SMI or serious mental illness, things like bipolar, things like schizophrenia, things like PTSD. And then, I'm very bullish on these products to be able to generate specificity in patient experience. And with all of the data we collect and with the integration of things like digital biomarkers into the products, I'm hopeful, I'm not promising, but I'm hopeful that we'll even be able to get to specific prescription digital therapeutics for things like schizoaffective disorder and for people with comorbid conditions.
Yeah, That certainly makes sense, almost like digital fingerprints or digital phenotypes that you could be.
Absolutely.
When you talk about schizophrenia, are you talking about treating some specific aspect of schizophrenia, like positive or negative symptoms, cognition, overall illness? Help me understand exactly specifically what you're talking about with schizophrenia.
Yeah, I mean, when we think about schizophrenia, I mean, the approvable endpoint here would be PANSS, and that obviously covers both positive and negative symptoms. We've done some work that would indicate an opportunity to treat positive symptoms, and we've got some earlier stage work which is targeted at negative symptoms.
To me, that would lend itself definitely to this.
Yeah, for sure. And that's the holy grail of a schizophrenia therapy. I think the thing that I'm heartened by is if you look at our product for schizophrenia or a product candidate, that's a product where we see some of the highest, if not the highest rates of engagement across all of our PDTs. And, we, from a lot of lay people, hear the objection, well, will a schizophrenic patient engage with a piece of technology? And it turns out that if you build it with them and you build it for them and you engage them in ways that resonate, then yes, they will participate, they will engage, and they will do so at more robust rates than we've seen across other patient populations.
Oh, I agree. I've done many schizophrenia trials, and more recently, the trials always include lots of software-based evaluations. And even some software-based compliance monitoring or adherence monitoring of taking the medication. And I find patients engage very well, surprisingly well, actually. Well, unfortunately, we're running out of time here, Corey. I feel like we could continue this for quite some more time. I have lots more questions, but maybe perhaps we could talk a little bit about how people could get more information and get more of their questions answered.
Absolutely. So you can find us at info@peartherapeutics.com. That's the most direct way for people to get information. And for prescribers, we have an active field force. I think to the extent that there is interest, please again send it to info@peartherapeutics.com. And we'd be more than happy to put people in touch with either field reps or with medical science liaisons. Again, it's our mission to make these products mainstream treatment.
And I guess you could just start out by going to peartherapeutics.com, the website, just for kind of a general sense of an overview.
That's right.
I also need to plug another conversation that we're going to be having. We're going to be having a webinar in January with Dr. Yuri Maricic, who's your Chief Medical Officer. And I'm very excited to be talking with Yuri. And the link to the webinar and the registration is going to be in the show notes of this very podcast, and pre-registration is actually available now. So people can already start registering for this webinar. And I want to thank everybody for listening today. And Corey, any final words?
No, I really just wanted to thank you for having us. And I wanted to thank your listeners for taking the time. Hopefully people have made it this far into the podcast. Again, we're very bullish on the opportunity to continue to develop new software-based therapeutics. And we're very thankful for the work that everyone out there does to treat this patient population.
Well, I certainly agree. And certainly we here at NEI are very interested in new technology, new therapeutics, the latest and best ways to try to help our patients. And so I want to thank everyone and wish you the best of luck with your clinical work. And thanks so much, Corey, for your time. I know how busy you are.
Wonderful. Thanks, Andy. It's been an absolute pleasure.
All right. Take care. Thanks, everyone, for listening.
Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the NEI podcast. Please let us know what you'd like to hear more about by leaving a review. Don't miss another episode. Subscribe today.